She was 22 years old, and her father sold her for $40. Not to a husband, not to a better life, to a stranger with land and silence and a reputation that made grown men cross the street. Lark Wen had spent her entire life building something that would never be hers. And the morning she finally understood that, she was already in the back of a wagon, watching her father's porch disappear behind a ridge of California oak. $40. That was the number. That was what a daughter was worth after 22 years of labor. She didn't cry. She was too angry to cry. If you want to know how a woman worth $40 saves 6,000 acres, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Lark Wen left her father's house, the sky was the color of old pewter, flat and heavy and offering nothing. It was the kind of sky that didn't promise rain. It just pressed down on everything beneath it like it was reminding the world of its own smallness. She'd been awake since before dawn, not because anyone told her to get up, but because she hadn't really slept. She'd lain on the thin straw mattress she'd slept on for 19 of her 22 years, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had always looked vaguely like a running dog, and she'd turned the number over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives underneath. $40. Her father hadn't even tried to make it sound like something else. That was the part that stayed with her. Wei Wen was not a man who wasted breath on softening the edges of things. He'd come into the kitchen the evening before, set his hat on the table, and told her that he'd made an arrangement with a cattleman named Gideon Voss who needed a ranch hand with particular skills. Someone who could repair equipment, keep records, manage a household, and work a fence line without constant supervision. "You'll go tomorrow," her father had said. He paid $40 against your labor for the season. Lark had been standing at the stove. She'd kept her back to him while he talked. The beans she was stirring had needed attention, and she'd given them all of it. Studying the way the wooden spoon dragged through the liquid, watching the slow rolling boil, doing the only thing she knew how to do when her father spoke about her future as if she weren't standing in the room. She listened. She didn't answer. She kept stirring. "Did you hear me?" he'd said. "I heard you." "You'll take your work clothes. He doesn't need anything else." Yes. That had been the whole conversation. $40, tomorrow. Work clothes, done. She hadn't asked why. She already knew. The harvest had been poor 2 years running, and her father owed money to the feed merchant in Colton and to a man named Birch who ran the only hardware supply between Colton and the river crossing. $40 didn't clear those debts entirely, but it moved them off the immediate column, and her father was a man who lived in the immediate column. Next week was theory. Tomorrow morning was real. The wagon had arrived at first light. An older man named Doyle, who worked for Voss's operation as a supply driver and occasional errand man. He was in his 60s, compact and weathered, with a gray beard he'd let grow into a rough wedge below his chin. He'd climbed down from the wagon, taken the small canvas bag Lark handed up to him, and tied it behind the seat without a word. Her father had stood on the porch. He hadn't come down to the yard. Lark had looked at him for a moment. He'd looked at the wagon. She'd climbed up. The oak ridge had swallowed the porch by the time the road bent east, and then her father's house was gone, as if it had never existed. Awesome. They rode for 3 hours before anyone said much of anything. Doyle drove the way old men drove, unhurried, hands loose on the reins, eyes on the horizon with the patience of someone who'd stopped expecting things to happen fast. The horses knew the road well enough that he didn't have to work them much. He just sat there and let the miles come. Lark sat on the bench beside him with her hands in her lap and watched the foothills unfold. She'd grown up in this part of California, knew the geography of it the way you know a face you see every day without particularly thinking about it. The dry gold of the late summer grass, the dark green clusters of oak and digger pine, the occasional red streaks in the hillside where iron ore ran close to the surface and stained the soil like old blood. It was familiar country. She'd never found it beautiful exactly, but it was hers in the only way that country can belong to someone who doesn't own it, by being the landscape of everything she'd ever known. "You done ranch work before?" Doyle asked. He didn't look at her when he said it. "My whole life," Lark said. "Your father's operation was small." It was. I still did the work. Doyle made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been nothing. "Voss's place is different. It's bigger than it looks from the road. Most people who come in don't understand the scale of it until they've been there a few days. What kind of man is he? Doyle thought about that longer than she expected. Careful, he said finally. Quiet. Keeps his own counsel more than most men do. He paused. He's fair, I'll say that. He doesn't ask for more than he'll give back. Lark considered that. In her experience, every man who was called fair by the people who worked for him had a different definition of fair than the people doing the working. But she didn't say that. She filed it away instead, the way she filed most things. Not discarded, not decided on, just held. They were about 2 hours east of the trading post at Colton when the rear wheel gave out. She heard it before she felt it. A sharp crack that traveled up through the wagon bed, followed immediately by a grinding lurch that threw Doyle hard against the left side of the seat and nearly pitched Lark off the right. The horses startled and pulled, and Doyle hauled back on the reins with both hands while the wagon dragged at an angle for 30 feet before stopping in the middle of the road. Hell, Doyle said. They climbed down. The right rear wheel had shed a spoke, and the rim had fractured clean at the joint. Not bent, broken, which was a different problem. Bent you could improvise around, broken you couldn't. Doyle walked a slow circle around the damage with his hands on his hips, and the expression of a man doing calculations in his head that kept coming out wrong. How far to the next stop? Lark asked. 6 miles, near enough. Draper's Settlement's got a smithy, but we'd have to leave the wagon here and ride the horses in. He looked at the load in the wagon bed. 200 pounds of grain sacks, a crate of tools, her bag. Can't leave this. Road's not safe for goods. Lark crouched down and looked at the brake. The spoke had given at the hub, which was a cleaner failure than it might have been. The hub itself was intact. The fractured rim section was about 8 inches of the total circumference, and the brake was square, not shattered. Do you have wire in the tool crate? She said. What kind of wire? Baling wire or heavier if you've got it. And a hammer, maybe a chisel. Doyle looked at her. I'm not going to fix it like it was new, she said, but I can bind it well enough to walk the horses slow and get us to Draper's without losing the load. If we wrap the brake tight enough and don't push them above a walk, the binding holds the rim together and distributes the load. It'll look terrible, but it'll work. You know this from doing it? I know it from having to. Doyle opened the tool crate. He had baling wire, a substantial coil of it, and a hammer and a flat pry bar that wasn't a chisel but would serve. He stood back while Lark worked. She didn't ask for his help, and he had the sense not to offer it condescendingly. When she needed a second pair of hands to hold tension on the wire while she wrapped, she told him what to do, and he did it. The repair took 40 minutes. It was ugly. The wire was wound in a dense figure-8 pattern around the brake, threaded through the nearest spoke mounts for stability, with a wedge of flat stone packed in to reduce movement at the fracture point. It looked like the work of someone with limited materials doing the best they could, which was exactly what it was. All right, Lark said, standing up and brushing her hands on her trousers. Walk them, don't let them trot, and stay on the flattest part of the road. Yes, ma'am, Doyle said, and there was nothing in his tone that was ironic or diminishing. He just said it like she'd earned it. They made Draper's Settlement before noon. She saw the valley for the first time late in the afternoon, when the road dropped out of a narrow cut between 2 hills, and the land opened up suddenly in a way that felt almost theatrical, like something a showman had arranged. The valley floor was broad and flat, maybe 2 miles across at the widest point, enclosed on 3 sides by low ridges covered in dry grass and scattered oak. A creek ran through the middle of it, catching the late afternoon sun and giving back a thin silver flash. There was good grass. Not lush, it was August, but thick and even, and the kind of color that meant water underground. The cattle grazing on the near side of the creek were clean and well-formed, which told her something about whoever managed the herd, but the house was small. That was what struck her first. Given the scale of the land, she could see fence lines extending far back toward the northern ridge. The house at the center of the valley was remarkably modest. A single-story cabin of rough-cut timber with a covered porch and 1 stone chimney, set back about 200 yards from the creek. There was a larger barn and a separate structure that might have been a tack room or small workshop, and a chicken yard, and a kitchen garden that had been worked seriously. But the house itself was the size of a place a homesteader might build in his first year, meaning to add on later and then never getting around to it. "That's his place?" she said. "That's it," Doyle said. "He's got 5 times as much land as my father had." More than that. Lark didn't say anything else, but she looked at that small house in the middle of all that space and felt the first real prickle of something she couldn't name. Not quite suspicion, but adjacent to it. A man with serious land and serious cattle who lived in a first-year cabin. A man called careful, called quiet, who kept his own counsel. There was a reason for that. She didn't know what it was yet, but there was a reason. Gideon Voss was sitting on the porch when the wagon came up the track. He stood as they pulled in, not hurrying, just rising in the unhurried way he seemed to do everything. He was taller than she'd expected, and thinner, with the kind of lean that came from years of hard outdoor work rather than any shortage of food. His hair was dark and cut roughly, and he had a beard he'd let grow to a point where it was either a deliberate choice or something he'd stopped paying attention to. He was maybe 35, maybe a little older. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw that started near his ear and ran down toward his chin, old enough that it was silver pale against the rest of his weathered face. He looked at the wheel when the wagon stopped. "What happened?" he said to Doyle. "Rim fractured on the Colton Road. She fixed it." He tilted his head in Lark's direction. Gideon Voss looked at Lark. Not at the wheel, not a quick glance. He actually looked at her for a moment, measuring something, she couldn't tell what. And then he said, "Does it need replacing entirely?" "Yes," Lark said. "The repair will hold long enough to get it to a smithy, but the fracture goes through the structural grain. It'll fail again." He nodded. "I know a man in Colton who can do it." He turned to Doyle. "Take the wagon in tomorrow and leave it with Harmon. Tell him I'll settle up end of month." "All right." Gideon Voss stepped off the porch and came to the wagon. He took Lark's canvas bag from behind the seat before she could. She almost said something about that. She was accustomed to carrying her own things, but she stopped herself. It wasn't worth the opening argument. "I'm Gideon Voss," he said, holding the bag. "You're Lark." "Lark when?" "Yes." "You've done ranch work." "All my life." "Your father said you can manage accounts and read survey." "I can read any kind of document. Survey, legal, ledger, whatever wants reading." He studied her again, that same measuring quality. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a dark gray-green, and that they were careful in a way that had nothing to do with coldness and everything to do with attention. This man was paying attention to the world around him in a way that was almost effortful, like a man who'd learned the hard way that inattention had consequences. "I'll show you the place," he said, and turned toward the cabin. She followed. But the cabin was 2 rooms. The main room served as kitchen and sitting area both, with a long table and 4 chairs that hadn't all matched to begin with and matched even less now. There was a cast iron stove that was old but functional, and shelves of provisions along one wall, and a window that looked east toward the ridge. The second room was smaller. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a wooden box for clothes. "This'll be your room," Gideon said. He set her bag on the floor near the bed. "I sleep in the barn most nights." "In the barn," Lark said. Not a question, more like an echo, because she needed a second to parse it. "There's a room I built off the tack room. It's comfortable enough." He paused. "The cabin belongs to you for as long as you work here. Your space is your space." Lark looked at him. "That's an unusual arrangement." "I suppose. Most men who hire ranch help don't vacate the house. Most men who hire ranch help don't have the arrangements I have." He said it without inflection, stating a fact, not defending anything. "There are things I'll need to explain about this property. Not tonight. Tomorrow. Once you've had a chance to settle. There's more to this situation than I put in the letter to your father." That word, situation, sat in the air between them. "What kind of situation?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had a way of pausing before answering that wasn't evasion. It was more like he was deciding how much to give at once. "A complicated one," he said. "One that's been going on for 11 years and hasn't resolved cleanly." He looked at the window. "The valley's worth more than it looks. There are men who want it, and one man in particular who's been working to take it since before my father died." He turned back to her. I need someone who can help me document things properly. Your father told me you had a particular gift for detail. Lark nearly laughed, not at the information, but at the source. Her father, selling her gift for detail along with her labor. It figured. He was right about that, she said. Good. He moved toward the door. There's food in the provisions. Help yourself to what you need. I'll see you at first light. Mr. Voss, she said. He stopped. The $40. My father told you it was for my labor for the season. That's right. I'll work the full season. But I want to know what I'm working toward. Not charity, not a wage that disappears into someone else's pocket. What does the arrangement look like from my end? He stood in the doorway for a moment. The evening light was coming in from behind him, putting his face in shadow, and she couldn't see his expression. At the end of the season, he said, if things go the way I think they might, there's a decision to be made about some property adjacent to the main ranch. Unclaimed workshop building and about 40 acres of bottomland. It belongs to the estate officially, but I've had no use for it. He paused. That's not a promise, it's a possibility. It depends on how things go. With the situation. Yes. He left. She heard his boots cross the porch and go down the steps, and then the quiet of the valley settled around her. The distant sound of cattle, the thin whistle of evening wind along the ridge, the creak of the cabin settling. Lark sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wooden wall. $40. An 11-year war over land. A man who slept in the barn, a valley worth more than it looked. She'd come here expecting to be used. She hadn't expected to find herself interested. In the days that followed, she learned the ranch the way she learned most things, by working it and paying attention. The cattle herd was larger than she'd estimated from the road. There were 240 head spread across 3 separate grazing areas, managed by a crew of 4 men who kept mostly to the bunkhouse at the north end of the property. Their foreman was a stocky Tejano named Mateo Reyes, 40-something and thick-armed, who spoke English with a rolling deliberateness that had nothing to do with uncertainty and everything to do with precision. He was clearly competent and clearly loyal to Voss, but he looked at Lark the first morning the way men on ranches tended to look at women who showed up without a clear category. Not hostile, but watchful, withholding. You're the new hand, he said, when they were introduced in the yard. I am. What's your work? Whatever needs doing. Records, repairs, documentation. I can work the fence line, and I know cattle. You know cattle from a 40-acre operation? I know cattle, she said simply. I know how they move when they're healthy and how they move when they're not. I know how they graze when the water's good and how they bunch when something scared them. What I don't know about your specific herd, I'll learn. Mateo looked at her for a long beat. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face relaxed slightly. Come look at the east herd with me this morning, he said. Tell me what you see. She went. She saw a lot. 3 of the yearlings on the eastern range were moving with a subtle stiffness in their right hind quarters that wasn't characteristic of the others. Not lameness, but tightness, possibly from salt lick imbalance or a stretch of bad grazing. She mentioned it quietly, without making a production of it. Mateo stopped walking and looked at the 3 animals for a long time. I noticed it 2 days ago, he said. Couldn't place it. It might be nothing, but I'd check their mineral intake. He looked at her with a different quality of attention after that. She was not accepted, not in any easy or official way. The 4 crew hands were polite but largely indifferent, the way men on a working ranch tended to be toward anyone whose position wasn't clearly established. But Mateo's slight recalibration mattered. He was the one who set the tone out here, and whatever he decided about her would filter through to the rest. Ouch. On her 3rd day, Gideon Voss told her about Rufus Crow. They were sitting at the table in the cabin after supper. Lark had cooked, a practical decision since the provisions were there, and Gideon's version of cooking appeared to involve a pot and grim determination. And Gideon had set out a pile of documents on the table. Some were in folders. Some were loose sheets of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had worn through. Some were older, written in a different hand, neat, careful script that differed markedly from Gideon's cramped, impatient writing. My father's, he said, indicating the older documents. He was more methodical than I am. Lark pulled the nearest sheet toward her. It was a survey record, hand-drawn, dense with measurements, dated 15 years back. The handwriting was indeed careful, almost architectural. Your father surveyed his own land? He was a surveyor before he was a rancher. He came west from Ohio in '49 and worked surveys for a decade before he put his money into this valley. Gideon poured himself coffee. He surveyed every inch of this property himself, kept records of everything, every boundary marker, every elevation, every water source. He paused. Those records are why we still own this valley, and why a man named Rufus Crowe has spent the last 11 years trying to destroy them. Lark looked up from the survey sheet. Rufus Crowe, Gideon said, came to this part of California about 12 years ago with a substantial amount of money and a willingness to use it in ways that honest men wouldn't. He started buying up land, some of it legitimate, some of it through arrangements I won't call purchases, because the men who signed over their deeds weren't always in a position to say no. He set down his coffee. When he turned his attention to this valley, he found a problem. My father had documented everything too well. The boundaries were clean, the title was clean, there was no ambiguity to exploit. He looked at the pile of papers. So he started making ambiguity. How? County Records Office. Crowe has 2 men in the county administration who've been helpful to him over the years. Survey markers on the eastern boundary were moved, small adjustments, a few feet at a time, over several years. When my father noticed, he filed a complaint. The complaint was lost. When he filed again, the office told him the records were unclear. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. My father died 2 years after that. Heart failure. He was 59, and he'd spent his last 2 years fighting something that should have taken 2 weeks to resolve in any honest county. Lark was quiet for a moment. And after your father died? Crowe filed a claim on the eastern section of the valley, about 1,600 acres, citing the adjusted survey data as evidence that the boundary had always run 200 yards west of where my father marked it. If his claim succeeds, it cuts off our access to the main creek tributary and about a third of the best grazing land. Gideon looked at her directly. I've been fighting it for 9 years. I've had 2 lawyers. The first one found something wrong with his own health when Crowe made certain things clear to him. The second one retired to Oregon very suddenly. He said it plainly, without drama, which made it worse. I have a third lawyer in Sacramento now, a man named Aldous Firth who Crowe doesn't know about yet. But the case needs documentation, specific documentation, the kind that requires going through years of survey records and cross-referencing them against what's currently recorded at the county and identifying every discrepancy. Which is why you need someone who can read survey, Lark said. Yes. And that's what the $40 was actually for. Gideon met her eyes. Your father told me you were capable of detailed documentation work. He also told me you'd come without questions if he sent you. I don't. He stopped. Started again. I needed someone I could trust with this information, and I couldn't hire from around here. Everyone in this county knows who Rufus Crowe is, and what happens to people who work against him. He paused. I understand if that changes things for you. Lark looked at the pile of documents. 15 years of careful, meticulous work by a man she'd never meet, trying to protect something he'd built from nothing. 11 years of a quiet, battle-scarred man fighting a war in the only way he knew how. Carefully, alone, waiting for the right angle. It doesn't change things, she said. It clarifies them. She pulled the nearest folder toward her and opened it. Walk me through what your father's notation system means, she said. The shorthand in the margins. I can read the survey itself, but his personal notation system, I need to understand the logic of it before I start cross-referencing. Gideon Voss looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more like the look a man gets when he's been bracing for something hard for so long that the unexpected absence of it takes a second to register. All right, he said. He pulled his chair around to her side of the table. Start here. He pointed to the first notation. They worked until the lantern ran low on oil. 3 days later, she found the first real discrepancy. She'd been going through the records in a systematic order, oldest to newest, cross-referencing her father's original survey, marks against the sequence of amendments and updates filed at the county over the years. Gideon had obtained copies of everything the county had on file, not by asking politely, but by sending Doyle on a specific errand to a county records clerk who apparently owed Gideon a personal favor from several years back. The copies were rough in places and some were partial, but they were enough. The discrepancy was in a boundary description filed 8 years ago, a minor amendment listed as a clerical correction to an earlier misdated document. At first glance, it looked administrative, the kind of thing that got filed and forgotten. But when Lark laid it against the original survey sheet with the corresponding date range, the clerical correction moved the eastern boundary marker by 14 feet. 14 feet, cited as a correction to a transcription error. But the original survey sheet showed no transcription error. The original coordinate was clear and intentional, marked with the notation her father used specifically for boundary points he considered critical, a small triangle with a dot in the center, 14 feet. Over a property line of several thousand feet, 14 feet wasn't visible to the eye. But it was the first in what turned out to be a sequence. Over 8 years, through 5 separate filings, each one described as a clerical correction or minor amendment, the boundary had walked 62 feet westward. 62 feet in a straight line along the entire eastern property boundary. The difference between where the boundary had been and where the current county record showed it to be was 1,600 acres. Lark sat back in her chair and looked at the numbers spread across the table. "Gideon," she said. He came from the other side of the room where he'd been reviewing the cattle ledger. He looked at what she'd laid out. She walked him through it. The sequence of amendments, the original notation, the accumulated drift. He didn't say anything while she explained. He just looked. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. "You found this in 4 days," he said. "I had good source material. Your father's system is very clean. My lawyers have been looking at these records for 9 years. They were looking for fraud," Lark said. "Your father's notation system isn't standard. To someone who doesn't know his shorthand, the critical boundary points look the same as the reference points. I only found this because you explained the notation to me." She looked at the table. "The triangle with the dot. It means he considered it non-negotiable. He marked every essential boundary point that way." Gideon pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. "This is enough?" Lark asked. "It's the beginning. We need all 5 amendment points identified and charted against the originals. And we need to verify that the markers on the ground still match my father's original coordinates." He looked at her. "That means walking the eastern fence line." "All right. It's rough country over there, and if Crow has people watching, we'll see them if they're there," Lark said. "And if they see us, we're just walking the fence line. That's normal ranch work." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "You're not worried?" "I'm very worried," she said. "I'm just not going to let that stop me from doing what needs doing." He was quiet again, then, "We'll go at first light." The eastern fence line was 4 miles long and ran along the base of a ridge that turned rocky and difficult in the northern section, loose shale and outcroppings that made the walking slow and demanded attention. They went out on horseback and tied the horses at the edge of the rock field, then continued on foot. Lark carried a notebook and a measuring chain. Gideon carried the same, plus a copy of the original survey sheet. They were checking for the first marked boundary post when Lark noticed the tracks. She didn't say anything immediately. She filed the information, boot prints, at least 2 sets, neither old, both heading north along the fence line, and kept working. But she watched the ridge above them for the next hour while they measured and notated. No movement. Either whoever had been here was gone, or they were very good at staying still. "Someone's been walking this line," she said, when they reached the first marker. Gideon looked at the ground. He saw it too. He didn't seem surprised. Crow has men who do assessment work, walk the boundaries, take their own measurements, look for anything that might be useful. He crouched and examined the marker post. "This one's been disturbed, recently." She looked at the post. The base showed fresh earth, not much, but the slightly different texture of soil that had been moved and repacked. Not professional quality interference, something faster and dirtier, done quickly. "They moved the marker," she said, "or tried to." Gideon dug around the base of the post with his knife until he reached the deeper anchor. "They only got the surface. My father sank these 3 feet." Lark made a careful notation of the position, the disturbance, and the precise measurement from the marker to the nearest permanent landmark. A specific rock formation 20 feet north that was too large to move. The number was 2 inches off from the original survey. 2 inches, recently moved, probably in the last week. "This is evidence," she said. "Yes." We need to document every marker on this line. Photograph isn't possible, but detailed notation with independent landmarks will hold in court, Gideon said. He was looking at the ridge. We need to do it fast. If Crow knows we're here, then we should stop talking and start measuring, Lark said. They worked through the heat of the afternoon, moving from post to post, notating each one's position relative to permanent landmarks, recording any sign of disturbance, charting the deviation from the original survey coordinates. Some markers were exactly where they should be. Some had been shifted. The pattern was consistent. The shifts were most severe in the northern stretch, where the county road ran close to the ridge, meaning that whatever claim Crow filed for that section would be easiest to access and most difficult to contest with visual evidence. By the time they got back to the horses, Lark's notebook was full of close notation, and her feet ached from the shale. She was also absolutely certain about something she hadn't been certain about 3 days ago. This land was being actively attacked, not with weapons, with paperwork, with measured, methodical, patient corruption that moved 14 feet at a time and hoped no one would ever notice. And the man who owned it had been fighting it alone for 9 years, slowly losing ground in ways he could feel but couldn't prove. She looked across the valley from the ridge height, the late sun catching the creek below, the cabin small and quiet at the center of it all. 6,000 acres. A decade of one man's war. All of it hanging on a careful notation in a dead man's survey records. She thought about the $40. She thought about the porch her father had stood on without coming down to say goodbye. She thought about what Gideon had said. A possibility. 40 acres of bottomland. A workshop. Not a promise. A possibility. She had built a life out of worse than possibilities. We need to get back, Gideon said from beside her. Yes, she said. She tucked the notebook inside her coat and turned toward the horses. Below them, the valley waited. Patient and full of old trouble, the grass gold in the evening light, the creek catching fire at the western end where the sun was going down behind the far ridge. Lark climbed back into the saddle without being helped. She didn't ask for help. She was already thinking about the next morning's work. The notebook filled up faster than Lark expected. By the end of her second week at the ranch, she had cross-referenced every survey amendment filed against the Voss property over the past 11 years and produced a sequential map of the boundary drift, a clean, methodical record showing exactly when each shift had occurred, how large it was, and which county official had signed off on the filing. 5 amendments, 5 signatures. 3 of them belonged to the same deputy clerk, a man named Harold Pearce, who had apparently been very busy with clerical corrections during the years when Rufus Crow was most actively pursuing his claim. She laid the completed chart on the table one evening after supper and slid it across to Gideon without comment. He picked it up, read it carefully, set it down. Harold Pearce, he said. He signed off on 3 of the 5 amendments, each one described as a transcription error correction, each one moving the boundary westward. Lark folded her hands on the table. I looked at the dates. The first 2 came within 6 weeks of your father's initial complaint. The third came the month after your father died. Gideon was quiet for a moment. My father knew about Pearce. He wrote about him in one of the later journals, said he suspected the man was in Crow's pocket, but couldn't prove it. The timing is suggestive, not conclusive, Lark said. But your lawyer in Sacramento, if he can pull Pearce's financial records for those years or find any correspondence between Pearce and Crow's operation, that's harder to come by than survey records. Harder isn't impossible. Gideon looked at her. It was the look she was getting used to, that particular quality of attention he gave things he was taking seriously. You've been here 2 weeks, he said. I have. You've done what 2 lawyers couldn't do in 9 years. Your lawyers were looking for fraud. I was looking for your father's notation system. She pulled the chart back toward her and smoothed a corner that had bent. The work was already done. I just found the thread and followed it. He was quiet again in that way he had, that deliberate pause before speaking. I'm going to write to Firth tomorrow. The lawyer. I'll send him the full chart and the fence line documentation. Include the photographs. She stopped. They had no photographs. Include the sketches I made of the marker positions. I was specific about the permanent landmarks. A surveyor can use those to reconstruct the exact deviations. I'll include everything. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the cabin. Outside, the September night had gone cool, and the crickets had started up in the grass near the creek. It was a comfortable sound, actually, though Lark didn't let herself dwell on that. She'd been cataloging small, involuntary comforts for 2 weeks and trying not to put too much weight on them. The way the valley smelled in the morning, cold and green, the sound of the cattle settling at dusk, the particular quality of light that came through the east window at midday and fell across the table in a way that made working through the afternoon documents less of a strain on her eyes. She wasn't here for comfortable. She was here for specific, practical reasons, and she kept that fact at the front of her mind, even when the smaller parts of the place pushed up against it. "I want to look at the journals again tomorrow," she said. "The last 3. Your father mentioned something in the margins of the final one, a reference to a second set of markers he placed after the first complaint. Insurance markers, he called them. I want to find out exactly where." Insurance markers. He expected someone to tamper with the primary posts. He was a methodical man. It would be exactly the kind of thing he'd do: place a second set of reference points somewhere less obvious, record them only in his private journals. Gideon looked at the pile of his father's journals stacked against the wall. There were 9 of them, dense, careful volumes that covered 20 years of the ranch's life. "You think there's a second record of the boundary? I think your father didn't trust the county, and he planned accordingly." Lark stood up from the table. "If the insurance markers exist and we can find them, we don't just have documentation. We have independent physical verification that predates every amendment Crow's men ever filed." That night, Gideon sat on the porch after Lark had gone inside, and he stayed there long enough that the moon came up over the eastern ridge and laid a thin silver line along the top of the fence post visible from the house. He was not a man who spent much time on hope. Hope was a word he'd worn out sometime around his father's second failed complaint, and he'd replaced it with something quieter and more durable, something closer to stubbornness. But there was a thing happening in this cabin that was different from anything in the past 9 years, and he sat with it on the porch in the dark and tried to understand what to do with it. He didn't come up with an answer. He went to bed in the barn room, and his sleep was better than usual. The journals were dense going. Her father's handwriting in the later volumes had grown smaller and more compressed, as though he'd been conserving paper or energy or both. And his personal notations, the observations and suspicions that lived in the margins alongside the official record-keeping, required careful interpretation. He wrote in a mixture of standard English and an abbreviated personal shorthand that Gideon could partially decode, having grown up watching his father write in it, but that required real attention to follow completely. Lark read systematically, front to back, with a secondary notebook open for transcription. It was in the 8th journal, the one covering the years immediately preceding his father's death, that she found the reference. It was in the margin of a page otherwise devoted to cattle health records, written at a slight angle as if added quickly. Section reference line, N ridge above Old Quinn claim. 3 posts, 18 inches deep, marked with father's chisel stamp. See sketch page 47. She turned to page 47. The sketch was small and precise, a section of the northern ridge above the valley, with 3 position marks indicated by the same triangle and dot notation she'd come to recognize as his signature for critical information. Each position was tied to a natural landmark, a distinctive rock face he'd sketched in profile, a section of the ridgeline that formed a specific silhouette, a dry creek bed that ran only in the wet season but whose course was carved permanently into the hillside. She brought the journal to Gideon in the yard, where he was working on a section of broken gate hinge. "Page 47, she said, holding it out. He wiped his hands on his work pants and took the journal. He read the margin note, looked at the sketch. His jaw tightened in that particular way she'd learned meant he was holding something in rather than letting it out. "He never told me about these," Gideon said. "He may have been protecting you. If Crow's people didn't know you knew, they couldn't pressure you to reveal them." Lark pointed to the sketch. "The rock face. Do you recognize the profile?" Gideon studied the drawing. "That's the North Ridge, above where the Quinn homestead used to be. Quinn sold out and left 8 years ago. The land's been fallow since." He looked up. "About 2 miles northeast of here. Can you find the exact position from that sketch?" "I know that ridge well. I think so." He looked at the sky, gauging the light. "Tomorrow morning, early." "Yes," she said. She took the journal back and went inside to make more notes. They found the first post before 8 in the morning. It was exactly where the sketch placed it. 18 inches deep, capped with a flat stone, the wood denser and darker than the surrounding soil suggested it should be after 15 years. Gideon brushed the earth away from the top and found the chisel stamp. His father's initials, JV, struck cleanly into the end grain. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. He did this the year before he filed his first complaint, Lark said. She was reading from the journal. He wrote, "Place secondary reference line in the event primary posts are disturbed or county record proves unreliable." He planned for this. 15 years ago. Gideon put his hand flat on top of the post. He left it there for a moment. Lark let him have that moment. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at the ridge and wrote in her notebook. They found the second and third posts within the hour. All three were where the sketch showed them. All three had the chisel stamp. All three were in positions that, when plotted against the original survey coordinates, established the eastern boundary with complete independent precision. A set of data points that had nothing to do with the county records office, and everything to do with a man who'd seen trouble coming and tried his best to leave a clear trail for whoever came after him. On the way back down the ridge, Lark said, "This changes the legal case significantly." "Yes. Your lawyer needs to see these posts in person, or have a registered surveyor verify them. The stamps are datable, the wood aging, the depth, the technique. An honest surveyor can confirm these were placed 15 or more years ago. Firth can arrange that." Gideon was quiet for a stretch of trail. "This is the thing I needed, the thing I didn't have before." "You had it before. You just didn't know where it was." He glanced sideways at her. "That's a generous way to say I missed it for 9 years. You didn't have someone to read the journals the way I read them." She shifted the notebook under her arm. "You knew the content well enough that you stopped seeing it as a document. You saw it as your father's writing. That's different." He didn't argue with that. He walked for a while. "He would have liked you," Gideon said. He said it simply, not as a compliment exactly, more like an observation he'd decided was accurate enough to state. Lark wasn't sure what to do with that. "He did good work," she said finally. He did. They came back down to the valley floor and split off toward their respective tasks. Gideon to write the letter to Firth in Sacramento, Lark to continue the records work. Neither of them marked the morning as anything in particular, but something had shifted between them, the way weight shifts in a structure when one of its supports finally locks into place. The first sign of Crow's escalation came on a Tuesday, in the form of a missing section of fence. Mateo brought it to Gideon's attention at midday. A 40-foot section of the south fence line near the creek crossing had been cut, not broken, cut cleanly with wire cutters at regular intervals, and a group of 11 cattle had drifted through the gap during the night. 8 had been recovered by mid-morning grazing on the eastern flat. 3 were missing. Gideon looked at the cut ends of the fence wire without comment. "Not an accident," Mateo said. "No. This section is a quarter-mile from the road. You'd have to know where to go." Someone who'd walked the line before would know exactly where to go. Gideon looked toward the road, which was invisible from here, but whose general direction he knew by long familiarity. The 3 that are missing? Any sign of which way they went? Tracks go north, toward the Quinland. The Quinland, fallow for 8 years, accessible from the county road without crossing any posted boundary. "Someone moved them," Lark said. She'd come out from the cabin when she saw Mateo and Gideon heading for the fence. She'd been listening from 6 feet behind them. You don't lose 3 cattle through a gap and have all 3 go the same direction. They were driven. Gideon looked at her. "It's a message," she said. "Not a serious theft attempt. If they wanted to steal cattle, they'd take more and they'd go further. This is..." He's testing the fence, testing the response time, testing whether you'll chase after strays or whether someone is watching the whole property. Mateo was looking at her with more interest than he usually showed. "She's right," he said to Gideon, with no particular reluctance about saying so. "This is a probe." "Repair the fence," Gideon said. "Today. And I want the south line walked every morning from now on." He looked at Mateo. "Quietly. Don't make a production of it." "And the missing cattle?" "Leave them. If someone's got them on the Quinland, riding up there to take them back is exactly what they want us to do." His voice was flat and deliberate. Let Crow think he got something. We'll account for 3 head in the record and let it sit. Mateo nodded and went to organize the repair crew. Lark walked back toward the cabin alongside Gideon. You think this will get worse? She said. It wasn't a question. I think Firth's letter reached Sacramento last week, and I think Crow has someone watching the mail routes who told him something moved. Gideon's voice was even, which was, she'd learned, the most concerning register he had. When something genuinely troubled him, he went very level. He's done this before. When my second lawyer started making progress, things happen. The kind of things that are hard to trace but make a point. What happened with the second lawyer? Gideon was quiet for a beat. Someone put fire to his office building in Colton. The lawyer wasn't inside, but everything was inside, all the documentation he'd assembled. He paused. He left for Oregon 2 weeks later. Lark stopped walking. Gideon stopped too and turned to look at her. The documentation we have here, she said. Yes, we need copies. Multiple copies in multiple locations. She was already thinking through the logistics. The original journals, we can't copy those. They need to stay here. But every piece of analysis I've produced, every chart, the fence line measurements, all of it, we need duplicates. One set to Firth, one set somewhere else. I have a cousin in Stockton, Gideon said. Not someone Crow would know about. We don't correspond much. Does your cousin have somewhere to keep papers safely? She runs a boarding house. She's got a deed box in the county clerk's office in San Joaquin. She's used it for her own property records. He paused. I could send her a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it unless I ask her to, or she receives word that I'm not able to ask her to. That works. Lark was moving again, back toward the cabin, faster now. I'll start copying tonight. She spent 3 nights on it. The copies were not perfect. Her handwriting was clear, but she was transcribing dense technical material at speed, and her hand cramped by the second hour each night. But the copies were accurate, checked twice against the originals. When she was done, she had 2 complete sets of documentation. The original charts and analyses in a folder on the table, and 2 copies, each wrapped in oilskin and sealed. Gideon sent one to Firth and one to his cousin in Stockton, both by different routes, through different carriers, on different days. Neither of them said out loud what they were preparing for, but they both knew what it meant to secure documents in multiple locations when you lived in a valley that a powerful man wanted. October came and brought the first real cold down from the ridge, and with the cold came a quality of industry that felt right to the season, the kind of work that comes with the closing of one cycle and the preparation for the next. Lark found her place at the ranch in the way that things fall into place when no one is paying particular attention to the falling. She didn't announce herself as competent. She just did competent things, consistently, and the people around her adjusted. Mateo had moved from watchful tolerance to a kind of gruff collegial acceptance. He'd come to her twice now with questions about the cattle records that she'd answered precisely enough that he stopped double-checking her answers. The 4 crew hands had settled into a casual acknowledgement of her presence that, if it wasn't warmth, wasn't the cold shoulder either. The only one she couldn't read was Gideon. He was not a man who gave much of himself easily. She understood that. She was not a woman who gave much of herself easily, and she recognized the underlying logic of it, the careful management of a person who'd been burned by trusting the wrong things too freely. But there were moments when the management slipped slightly, when something more direct showed through. One evening, she was working late at the table when he came in from the barn and saw the lamp still lit and stopped in the doorway longer than was necessary before asking if she needed anything. She said no. He said he'd made extra coffee. She said she'd have some. He brought it and sat at the far end of the table and picked up a ledger he'd been working on, and they sat in the quiet for an hour saying almost nothing, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that meant 2 people had stopped needing to fill space to feel safe in it. She noticed that. She filed it in the category of things she was not going to examine too closely. What she did examine closely was the information she was accumulating about Rufus Crow. She hadn't set out to research him specifically, but his name appeared often enough in the county documents and in the older local records she'd been using as reference, that a picture of him assembled itself gradually, the way a face comes into focus in a developing photograph. He'd come to the county 12 years ago from somewhere further south. The documents were vague about the specifics, which was itself suggestive, with money enough to buy 2 existing operations outright and an appetite that didn't stop at 2. He now held title to 11 properties in the county, ranging from small homestead parcels to a 3,000-acre hay operation north of Colton. The Voss Valley was the gap in his geography, a piece of land that sat between two of his larger holdings, and that, if he controlled it, would give him unbroken access from the county road all the way to the eastern hills. What struck her about the pattern was not the scale of it, but the method. Every acquisition Crow had made followed a similar shape: period of pressure, boundary dispute, or debt complication. A sale that often looked distressed from the outside, but that the county records recorded as straightforward. Two of the former owners had moved out of the county. One had died in a barn fire that the inquest had declared accidental. Lark copied that last detail into her notebook and underlined it. She was not a woman given to fear in the general sense. Fear required enough safety in your life to have something to lose, and she'd never had enough safety to acquire the habit. But she was a woman who paid attention to information, and the information about Rufus Crow was the kind that required a specific quality of attention, the kind that didn't blink. She wrote up a summary of everything she'd compiled on Crow's acquisition history and put it in the folder with the survey analysis. She didn't show it to Gideon immediately. She needed to think about what it added to the picture and whether it was the kind of thing that would help or the kind that would harden something that was better kept flexible. In the end, she showed it to him on a Thursday afternoon, sitting at the table with the document spread between them and the autumn light coming through the east window in its clean midday angle. Gideon read it the way he read everything, carefully, without rushing. When he was done, he put the pages down flat on the table and looked at the wall for a while. "The barn fire," he said. "I know. The man who died was named Emmett Cole. He had 120 acres adjacent to Crow's North operation. He was the only one in that acquisition sequence who didn't simply sell and move." Gideon's voice was level, very level. "I knew Emmett Cole slightly. He was stubborn, the kind of man who wouldn't move." Lark said nothing. She let that sit. "This doesn't go to Firth," Gideon said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because Firth is fighting a land case, not a criminal investigation. If I put this in front of him, it changes what we're doing, and it opens doors I don't have the means to walk through safely yet." He met her eyes. "Crow will hear about a criminal complaint before the ink dries on the filing, and unlike a land case, a criminal complaint is something a man like Crow considers personal." Lark thought about that. "You think the land case is safer? I think the land case is what we can win, and winning it takes away what Crow wants most." He paused. "When the land case is done, when this valley is legally and permanently protected, then the rest of it goes where it needs to go." She didn't entirely agree, but she understood the logic, and she understood that it was his call. "Keep the summary," he said. "Keep it in the folder, but we don't use it until the land case is settled." "All right," she said. She folded the pages and put them at the back of the folder, behind the survey charts. Outside, the first of the October wind came down from the ridge and moved through the valley grass in a long, visible wave, bending everything in the same direction for a moment before releasing it. Somewhere on the county road, 3 miles south, a rider Lark had noticed twice in the past week passed the junction to the ranch track without turning in, moving at a pace that was slightly too measured to be a man simply going somewhere. She watched him from the window. She noted the horse, a gray with a white left foreleg, distinctive enough to remember. She added it to the notebook. The gray horse with the white left foreleg appeared 4 more times in the following 2 weeks. Lark kept the count in the back of her notebook, in the margin of a page otherwise devoted to fence post measurements, a private tally that she didn't show to Gideon until she had enough of a pattern to be worth showing. The rider never turned in at the ranch track, never stopped, never did anything that could be called suspicious by any official definition of the word. He simply passed. But he passed at intervals that were too regular to be coincidence, and at times that were specifically the morning and evening hours when a man doing assessment work would want to see how many people were moving on a property and in which directions. She showed Gideon the tally on a Friday evening. He looked at it for a moment. "Same horse every time?" "Gray, white, left foreleg, black tail. Not a common combination." She tapped the notebook. "Morning passes at 7 to 8. Evening passes at 5 to 6. He's counting heads. Crow is mapping our daily movement. He's mapping response time. He wants to know how quickly this ranch reacts to things happening at the perimeter. Lark closed the notebook. He's planning something that requires knowing when the fewest people are near the house. Gideon sat with that for a moment. When does Firth expect to file? You said 3 to 4 weeks when you last wrote to him. 3 weeks then, maybe less. He was looking at the window. Outside, the October dusk was settling over the valley in shades of gray and dark gold, and the first of the nighttime cold was starting to move down from the ridge. We need to get through 3 weeks without losing the documentation. The copies are already with Firth and with your cousin. Even if something happened to the originals here, the originals matter, Gideon said quietly. The journal with the insurance marker sketch, the original survey sheets with my father's notation, copies are supporting evidence. The originals are the case. He turned from the window. We keep them here, we keep them safe, and we get to the filing date without incident. Lark wanted to say, and if we don't? But she already knew his answer to that, and she already knew her own, and there wasn't much point in saying either of them out loud. She got up and went to the provisions shelf and moved the loose board behind the flour tin, a hiding spot she'd found on her second day, originally used, she guessed, for petty cash. The folder of originals was already there, wrapped in oilskin. She checked the wrap, checked the tin was flush against the board, and went back to the table. Gideon watched her do all of this without comment. Then he said, I told Mateo to put 2 men on the south perimeter at night. Starting when? Starting tonight. She nodded. It was the right call. 2 weeks late, but the right call. Good. Well, the fire started on a Tuesday night in the east pasture, in the dry grass along the creek bank where the cattle had grazed the ground down thin and the remaining stubble had been curing in the autumn heat for weeks. Lark woke to the smell of it before she heard anything. A specific quality of smoke, not the clean wood smoke of the cabin stove, but something heavier and more urgent that pushed under the window and into her sleeping nostrils with enough insistence to bring her upright before she was fully conscious of being awake. She was at the window within seconds. The eastern sky above the ridge showed an orange smear that was too low and too diffuse to be sunrise and too large to be anything other than what it was. She pulled on her boots and coat and was on the porch when Gideon came running from the barn. Pasture fire, he said, not to her specifically, just saying it, the way you say a fact out loud to make it real and manageable. He was already moving toward the barn for the horses. How many cattle on the east side? 30 head. Mateo's got them. He was already up. He pointed toward the eastern field, where Lark could see the dark shapes of the crew moving against the orange light, men on horseback pushing the herd northward away from the fire line. The fire itself was visible now from the porch. Not a wall of flame, but a spreading low burn moving through the dry creekside grass, pushed by the east wind that came down the ridge every night around midnight. It was manageable. Lark could see that much even from the porch. The fire was bad, but not catastrophic. No structures were in its path, and the crew was already moving the cattle clear. If they could get a brake line dug on the west side of the burn before the wind shifted, they could contain it before it reached the main grazing land. She went to help. She spent 2 hours with a shovel at the edge of the fire break line, working alongside 2 of the crew hands in the smoky dark, digging and scraping and stamping out advance embers that jumped the break before it was fully established. Her hands blistered by the second hour. Her lungs ached from the smoke. The ground was hard and her shovel kept glancing off rocks in the subsoil, and the man working next to her, a young hand named Corbett, who she'd exchanged maybe 20 words with in 2 months, swore steadily and creatively at every obstacle, and she found herself mentally agreeing with each one. The break held. By 3 in the morning, the fire was contained. The east pasture had lost about 60 acres of grazing grass, which was a serious problem for winter feed, but the herd was intact and the structures were untouched. Gideon came to the break line when it was over, walking the length of it and looking at the burned ground. He stopped near Lark. His face was black with ash in the places where he'd been working close to the fire, and he smelled of smoke, and he was looking at the burn pattern in a particular way. Where did it start? Lark said. South end of the creek bank, near the crossing. He paused. Mateo says the grass there was cut. The cattle hadn't grazed it. It was standing. Standing grass burns faster and hotter than grazed ground. Someone piled the cut grass. Mateo found a scatter of cut material near the start point. Could be coincidence. Wind picks things up. His voice said he didn't think it was coincidence. Could be someone walked the creek bank earlier with a scythe and left material that would catch fast when lit. Lark looked at the burned ground. And the rider with the gray horse has been clocking our night movements for 2 weeks. Gideon said nothing. He kicked a piece of charred root with his boot and watched it roll. We held the line, she said. This time. She looked at him. The firelight was dying and the eastern sky was starting to go gray-blue with the beginning of pre-dawn. His face was tired in a way that was old, not from this one night, but from all the nights in the last 11 years that had looked like this. Men watching from a distance. Lines crossed in ways that were designed to be deniable. The slow accumulation of damage that was never quite enough to bring in a sheriff, but was always enough to wear you down. She wanted to say something about that. She didn't find the right words. Get some sleep, she said instead. I'll start the damage assessment at first light. He looked at her for a moment with that careful measuring quality she'd come to know. You should sleep too. You've been up all night. I will. After the assessment. He didn't argue. He knew by now that was the same as having agreed. Tools. She did the damage assessment. She also, in the same morning, walked the south end of the creek bank and found what Mateo had found. The scattered cut grass near the ignition point, already half dispersed by the night wind but visible enough in the right morning light. She took note of the pattern and the position, measured the distance from the cut material to the nearest fence post, and added it to the folder. Evidence of arson wasn't the same as proof of arson. She knew that. But it was the kind of thing that a good lawyer could put in front of a judge, alongside 11 years of boundary fraud and the acquisition history of a man who'd already had one neighbor's barn burn and let the pattern speak for itself. She wrote it up that evening and added it to the folder. The folder was getting substantial now, a record of a sustained campaign against this property that had the weight and specificity of something that would be very difficult to dismiss as a series of unfortunate coincidences. 2 days after the fire, a message arrived from Aldous Firth in Sacramento. Gideon read it at the table and then read it again, which was not his habit. He set it down. He's ready to file, he said. He says the survey documentation is strong enough. He wants to proceed. Lark felt something release slightly in her chest. When? He says 2 weeks. Gideon looked at the message again. He's asking whether we have the original journals and survey sheets secured. He'll need them for the hearing. A sworn surveyor will need to examine the insurance marker records in person and verify the chain of evidence. When is the hearing? 6 weeks from filing. 6 weeks. She did the arithmetic. The filing in 2 weeks, the hearing 6 weeks after that. They needed 8 weeks of uninterrupted custody of the originals. 8 weeks of keeping the documents safe from whatever Rufus Crowe decided to do when he realized the case was actually going to court. He'll know when Firth files, Lark said, within a day or two. The county courts are not a secret. Then we have about 2 weeks before this valley gets significantly more dangerous than it already is. She looked at the folder. And the documents need to stay here until the surveyor comes to examine them. We can't send the originals to Firth. The chain of custody requires they stay in our possession until the hearing. Gideon nodded. He'd already thought through all of this. She could see it in the lack of surprise in his face. Then we protect them here, he said. Yes. She paused. Gideon. He looked at her. That rider, the gray horse. He hasn't passed in 4 days. His expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted slightly. That internal recalibration she'd learned to read. You think he got what he needed. I think he stopped watching because the watching part is done. They looked at each other across the table in the quiet cabin with the autumn wind moving outside the walls, and neither of them said what that meant. They didn't need to. The feed barn burned 11 days later. It was different from the pasture fire. The pasture fire had been a probe, a test of response. The feed barn fire was a statement. It started at 4 in the afternoon when Lark was in the cabin working and Gideon was in the north field with Mateo looking at a section of fence that had come down in the previous night's wind. The barn was at the south end of the compound, 50 yards from the cabin, and it went up fast. Stored hay burns with a particular ferocity, and whoever had set this one had set it well. Multiple ignition points along the base of the south wall, which Lark understood only later when the fire investigators' examination told them what she'd already suspected. She heard it from inside the cabin. Not the fire itself, but the horses. The way they screamed in the adjacent corral when the smell hit them, a sound that was immediately, unmistakably wrong. She was out of the cabin and into the yard before she could form a conscious thought about it, and she saw the south barn wall fully engaged, a sheet of bright climbing flame 15 feet high, with the smoke already turning black at the top where the stored grain was catching. She ran for the water pump. She ran for the bucket line. She did both of those things in quick order, shouting for whoever was in earshot. And Corbett came out of the tack room at a run, and she sent him for the crew while she started on the pumping. But even in those first seconds, even while she was pumping and shouting and thinking about the water pressure and the distance to the barn, she was thinking about something else. The documents, not the copies. The originals. The folder behind the flour tin, the journals stacked against the cabin wall. They were in the cabin, which was 50 yards from a burning barn, and if the fire jumped, if the wind shifted, if the burn became uncontrollable, if someone had planned for exactly this scenario, knowing that a burning barn 50 yards from a cabin would draw every person on the property toward the barn and away from the cabin. She stopped pumping. She handed the bucket to Corbett, who had just arrived. "Keep at it," she said. "Get everyone on the water line." "Where are you going?" She was already running for the cabin. The cabin was clear when she went in. No smoke, nothing on fire, the door still standing open from when she'd run out. She went straight to the provisions shelf, moved the flour tin, pulled the folder. She went to the journals, all 9 of them, and stacked them against her chest. She stood there for 1 second in the middle of the cabin with her arms full of paper and leather and years of careful work and thought. Where? Not the cabin. Not if the fire spread. Not the barn, obviously. The tack room was too close. The chicken yard was exposed. The workshop. There was a small stone-walled workshop at the northwest end of the property, one of the oldest structures on the ranch, built by Gideon's father from Fieldstone, squat and solid and separated from every other building by a wide open yard. Its roof was low-pitched tin, not wood shingle. It was far enough from the barn that a direct jump was nearly impossible, and close enough to the ridge that the wind would carry any spread away from it rather than toward it. She carried the documents across the yard at a run, feeling ridiculous and correct at the same time, smoke in the air, and the sound of the fire behind her and the shouts of men at the water line, and she reached the workshop and pulled the door open and went inside and put the journals and the folder on the stone shelf at the back wall, the furthest point from the door, the furthest point from any window, and stood there for a moment breathing hard in the cool stone-smelling dark. Then she went back to the water line. The feed barn was a total loss. They couldn't save the structure. It was too far gone by the time the full crew assembled, and the water pressure was never going to be adequate for a fire that size. What they could do, and what they did, was prevent the spread. They soaked the ground and the fencing and the adjacent structure walls. They kept the horses clear and the tack room wet. And they stood in a line with buckets and shovels and watched the barn burn down to its frame while the smoke went straight up in a dirty gray column into the October sky. Gideon got back from the north field when the barn was already half gone. He came into the yard on horseback, took in the situation in one long look, and tied the horse to the corral rail and came to stand with the crew. He didn't run around, he didn't shout. He just looked at what was burning and assessed what could still be done and did it, which was keeping the adjacent structures wet and the fire from spreading. When it was over, when the frame had collapsed and the fire was settling into ember and low smoke, he walked the perimeter of the burn and looked at the ground. Lark came and stood beside him. "Multiple ignition points," she said. "South wall, at least 3 that I could see from the start." "Yes." He was looking at the base of what had been the south wall, where the fire had burned hottest and longest. "Planned." "Yes." She paused. "Gideon, the documents." He looked at her sharply. "They're in the workshop, the originals, all of them. I moved them when the fire started." She held his eyes. "I thought, if someone set this barn to bring everyone outside and away from the cabin..." Gideon looked at the cabin, then at the workshop, then back at the burned barn frame. He was very still for a moment. "The cabin was empty the whole time," he said. "For about 20 minutes, while everyone was at the fire." She paused. "If someone came in the back while we were at the south end of the compound..." He walked to the cabin without another word. She followed. The flour tin had been moved. Not significantly, an inch, maybe 2. Someone who hadn't known exactly what they were looking for might have moved it and not found what was behind it and put it back close enough to where it had been. The hiding spot wasn't a sophisticated one. A person with time and a reason to look would have found it in under 2 minutes. Gideon stood looking at the displaced tin for a moment. "They came in while we were fighting the barn," he said. "Yes. And they found the hiding spot." "And found it empty." Lark looked at the shelf. "Because I'd already cleared it." He turned and looked at her. She had nothing particular to say about it. She'd made a fast decision under pressure, and the decision had been right, and standing here accepting credit for it felt awkward in a way she couldn't entirely explain. "I had a bad feeling," she said. "When the barn went up, it was too convenient." "It was," he said. "We need a better hiding place, something that isn't in this cabin at all. The workshop. For now, but we need to think about the hearing. 6 weeks is a long time to keep documents safe from someone who's already proved he'll burn buildings to get them." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the open cabin door, and he was tired, deeply, bone-tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hours spent at the fire line and everything to do with 11 years of exactly this kind of thing. She could see it in the way he stood, the weight of it, the way a man looks when he has been bracing against something so long that the bracing has become the posture. "I need to write to Firth tonight," he said. "I need to tell him what happened here and ask him to accelerate the filing if at all possible." He paused. "And I need to tell Matteo to put every available man on perimeter watch beginning tonight." "Yes. And I need to tell you something." He stopped. She waited. "When this started," he said, choosing his words slowly, "I told you there was a complicated situation. I told you what I needed and what I could offer at the end of it." He looked at the displaced flour tin. "I didn't tell you how dangerous it was. Not fully." He met her eyes. "I should have." Lark considered that. "I would have come anyway," she said. "That's not the point." "I know what the point is." She looked at him steadily. "The point is that you feel responsible for the risk I'm in." She paused. "The risk was already here when I arrived. You didn't create it. You've been living in it for 11 years. She turned toward the door. "I'm going to get Corbett to help me rig a proper lock for the workshop. And then I'm going to eat something because I haven't eaten since breakfast." She stopped in the doorway. "Write your letter to Firth." She went out. She was in the yard before she let herself feel the full extent of what the afternoon had cost her. The shaking in her hands that she hadn't let show, the residual smell of smoke deep in her hair and her coat, the precise moment when she'd stood in the burning compound with her arms full of journals and felt for the first time since arriving at this valley like she was genuinely afraid. Not for the documents, for this place, for the man who'd been carrying it alone. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs until they steadied, and then she went to find Corbett. Well, that night, after the letter to Firth was written and sealed, and after Matteo had posted 2 men at the south perimeter and 1 at the road junction, Gideon came to the workshop where Lark was making the lock adjustment with Corbett. Corbett finished the last screw on the bracket and tested the hasp and declared it solid and went to his bunk. Gideon came inside the workshop and looked at the journals on the stone shelf. He picked up the last one, the 8th journal, the one with the sketch on page 47. He stood there holding it for a moment. "My father's handwriting," he said. Not to Lark specifically, just saying it. She was coiling the leftover wire from the lock job. She let him have the silence. He knew it would come to this, Gideon said. The insurance markers, the sealed notations. He built this whole system expecting someone to come for it eventually, and he spent the last years of his life watching them come and not being able to stop it. He set the journal back on the shelf. He died thinking he'd failed. "He didn't fail," Lark said. "He built you a case. It just took the right person to find it." Gideon looked at her. "That's not nothing," she said. "Leaving something that actually works, that's not failure." He stood in the doorway of the stone workshop, the night behind him, and he looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at things he was deciding how much to trust. Then he said, "No, I suppose it's not." He left. She stayed in the workshop long enough to check the shelf one more time, to verify the lock, to look at the stack of journals in the dark stone room that smelled of old iron and dry wood and the cold of the season coming on. 9 journals, a sketch on page 47, a triangle with a dot in the center. Somewhere in the valley, Crow's men were watching, maybe at the road junction, maybe closer. She didn't know exactly where the next thing would come from or what shape it would take. But the documents were intact, and the case was 10 days from being filed, and she was still here. She locked the workshop door behind her and walked back to the cabin through the dark. Firth filed the case on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after the feed barn burned. Gideon got word by messenger that afternoon, a brief note in Firth's careful hand confirming that the Voss land claim had been formally entered with the Sacramento District Court, that a hearing date had been set for 6 weeks out, and that a registered surveyor named Clement Boaz would arrive at the ranch within the week to examine the original documents and the insurance marker posts in person. Firth had written one additional line at the bottom, below his signature. Proceed with caution. These things have a way of stirring before they settle. Gideon read the letter twice and handed it to Lark without comment. She read it, set it on the table, and said, "How long before Crow knows?" "He may already know. Firth filed in the morning, court clerks talk by afternoon." Gideon looked at the window. The November light was thin and flat, the sky the color of old ash. "I'd say we have until tomorrow before it reaches him. Maybe tonight." They sat with that for a moment. "Mateo," she said, "I'll talk to him this evening." He picked up the letter and folded it carefully. "Boaz comes this week. We need the originals accessible but secured. The workshop lock is solid. Boaz will need to examine the insurance markers on the ridge, too. That means at least half a day out on the north fence line, both of us with him." She paused. "That leaves the ranch short." "I know. We can't all be on the ridge at the same time. If Crow decides that's his window—" "I know, Lark." He said it quietly, not cutting her off, just acknowledging that they were both running the same calculations and arriving at the same uncomfortable answers. "We'll figure out the logistics when Boaz arrives, and we know his specific requirements." She didn't push further. She went back to the table and her work. But for the rest of that evening, she found it difficult to concentrate, the sentences in the documents swimming slightly when she tried to read them, her mind moving ahead to the 6 weeks between now and the hearing and the shape of what could happen in that gap. Firth had warned them. These things have a way of stirring before they settle. She understood what that meant. She'd been watching Rufus Crow's methods for 2 months, and she understood them with a clarity that was neither comfortable nor particularly useful on its own. Understanding what a man was capable of was not the same as being able to stop him. She went to bed before the lamp ran out of oil. She lay on the narrow bed in the dark and listened to the wind move down the ridge, and she thought about her father's porch and the $40, and the morning she'd climbed into Doyle's wagon. She thought about that version of herself, 22, furious, watching the Oak Ridge swallow everything she'd ever known, and tried to locate the distance between that person and this one. It wasn't as large as she might have expected. Same hands, same temper kept carefully below the surface. Same stubbornness that her father had called a flaw, and that had kept her working through 3 nights of copying documents by lamplight and 2 hours on a firebrake shovel at midnight. What was different was the 40 acres, the workshop and the bottom land that Gideon had mentioned on her first night. Not a promise, a possibility. She'd kept it at a careful distance in her mind for 2 months, not wanting to build on it because building on possibilities was how you got hurt when they didn't come through. But lying in the dark, she let herself look at it directly for once. The workshop. Stone walls, low ceiling, a long bench along the south wall that she'd examined when she moved the documents and found solid despite its age. The bottom land. She'd seen it from the ridge. A flat 40-acre section along the creek tributary, heavy soil, good water access. A woman with tools and material and 40 acres of good bottom land could build something that was entirely her own. She turned onto her side and told herself to sleep. She almost managed it. Clement Boaz arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after the filing. He was not what Lark expected. She'd pictured a surveyor as a dry, meticulous sort of man, all instruments and precise language. Boaz was meticulous, certainly. She could see that in the way he organized his kit on the cabin table, every tool in a specific position, the surveying chain wound with a particular care. But he was also large, broad-shouldered, with a red-gray beard and hands like a blacksmith's, and he had a way of looking at the landscape that was almost hungry, like a man who genuinely loved what the physical world told him when he paid it proper attention. He shook Lark's hand when Gideon introduced them, which not all men did, and he said, "You're the one who found the insurance markers from the journal sketch." "Yes." "Good work. Most people look at a hand-drawn sketch from 15 years back and see a picture. You saw a location." He picked up his surveying chain and tested the hook. "Show me the journal first, then we'll go to the ridge." They spent the morning in the cabin. Boaz went through the journals with the thoroughness of a man who respected primary documents. He wore clean cotton gloves to handle the older pages, which Lark had not anticipated, and he examined the triangle and dot notation with a magnifying lens and made notes in a ledger that he'd brought specifically for this examination. He asked questions about the notation system, about the dates, about the chain of custody since Gideon's father's death. Gideon answered everything directly and without embellishment, which was the right approach with a man like Boaz. Lark could see that Boaz was the kind of professional who made up his mind quickly when he heard hedging and didn't usually make it up in your favor. When they finished with the journals, Boaz sat back and looked at the sequence of county amendment filings that Lark had charted. He was quiet for a long time. 14 feet in the First Amendment, he said. "Yes." "And the cumulative drift is 62 feet over the full boundary length. Over approximately 4,000 linear feet of boundary, yes." He looked at her chart. "This is very clean documentation. The source material was clean. I followed the thread." Boaz looked at Gideon. "Your lawyer told me the case was solid. I don't usually agree with lawyers in advance of my own examination." He closed his ledger. "Let's go look at the posts." The ridge walk took most of the afternoon. Boaz was thorough in a way that cost time. He didn't just look at each insurance marker. He measured from it to 3 independent fixed points, recorded the elevation, examined the wood aging and the chisel stamp with the magnifying lens, and made detailed notes before he would move on. Lark had expected to find this process tedious. She didn't. Watching a competent person work carefully was its own kind of satisfaction. They found all 3 posts exactly as they'd found them before. All 3 had the chisel stamp. All 3 verified against the original survey coordinates within acceptable tolerance. Boaz explained what that meant, running through the arithmetic with a precision that made Lark follow every step. On the way down as the sun was going low, Boaz said to Gideon, "These posts establish the original boundary with independent physical verification that predates every county amendment on file. There is no legitimate survey interpretation that puts the eastern boundary where Crow's claim says it is." He paused for a moment. "I've been doing this work for 22 years. I've seen a lot of boundary disputes. Some of them are genuinely ambiguous. This one is not." Gideon said, "Will you testify to that?" "That's why Firth hired me." They came back down to the valley as the dark was coming on, and Lark made supper because the cabin had food, and Boaz had been on the road for 2 days, and nobody had eaten since noon. Boaz ate with the directness of a working man and complimented nothing but cleaned his plate entirely, which she considered the better compliment. He left the next morning with his ledger and his notes and his surveying chain wound neatly back on its spool. After his horse disappeared around the road bend, Gideon stood in the yard for a moment. 5 weeks, he said. 5 weeks, Lark confirmed. They went back to work. Thus, the armed men came on a night when the moon was down. It was 3 weeks after Boaz's visit, which put them 2 weeks from the hearing. Mateo had kept the perimeter watch going, 2 men on the south line every night, 1 at the road junction, but the north approach, the ravine system that cut down from the ridge above the Quinland, had been watched less consistently. It was rough country up there, steep and loose-footed, and Mateo had assessed it as too difficult for a serious approach. Lark had noted the assessment and not disagreed because she hadn't had a better argument at the time. She had a better argument now, hearing the horses in the ravine at 2 in the morning. She was awake when she heard them. She'd been sleeping badly for the past week, the kind of shallow, fragmented sleep that happened when the background tension in your life got elevated enough to keep part of your brain running even when the rest of it was down. She heard the horses, and she was at the window in seconds, and she could see nothing because the moon was down and the night was as dark as it got in that valley. But she could hear the careful movement of animals being walked slowly over rough ground, and she could hear the murmur of voices keeping themselves very low. North side. The ravine. More than 2 horses. The sound was layered, Multiple animals. She counted what she thought was 4 or 5 before she stopped counting and started moving. She pulled on her boots and coat and took the iron fire poker from beside the stove, not because it was an effective weapon against armed men, but because it was something and nothing was worse, and went to the barn at a run. Gideon was already awake. She nearly ran into him in the dark of the barn doorway, and she grabbed his arm before she understood who it was. "North Ravine," she said, dropping her voice to almost nothing. 4 or 5 horses. They're coming down." "I heard them." He had a rifle. He moved past her into the yard and stopped, listening. The sounds from the ravine were clearer now. They weren't trying to be silent anymore. They'd gotten past the rough section and hit the flat ground at the ravine mouth, and the horses had picked up pace. Lark counted again. 4 horses. 4 riders. Moving toward the cabin at a steady walk that would become a run if they decided to. "Mateo," she said. "His men are on the south line. They won't hear this until it's over." Gideon was already moving toward the north end of the compound. He stopped and looked back at her. "Go to the workshop. Lock the door." "No." "Lark, you have 1 rifle and 4 men coming down from the ridge," she said. "Lock the workshop door and then what? You hold them off alone?" She took a breath. "What do they want?" He was quiet for a second. "The documents, or me. Possibly both. They're not here to kill you. If they were here to kill you, they'd have come faster and louder." She was thinking as she talked, moving her mind through the layout of the compound the way she'd moved through it every day for 3 months. They want the documents, and they want to hurt the case. If they can take the originals before the hearing, the workshop. Yes. If they know about the workshop, she stopped. They searched the cabin. They didn't find anything. They might not know about the workshop move. Or they might. The riders were visible now. Dark shapes at the north end of the compound, coming in through the gap where the feed barn had stood before it burned. 4 of them. Big men, moving with the confidence of people who'd assessed the situation and decided it was manageable. One of them had a rifle across his saddle. The others, she couldn't see clearly. Gideon raised his own rifle. "Who are you?" he called out, loud, steady, no tremble in it. The lead rider pulled up. The others stopped behind him. Silence for a moment. "We don't want trouble," the lead man said. His voice was flat and practiced. A man who said that sentence for a living. "We're here to collect certain documents that belong to a client of ours. Hand them over and we leave." "Documents on this property belong to this property," Gideon said. "You're trespassing. You need to turn those horses around. We need to do that less than you think." The man moved his horse forward 2 steps. "There's 4 of us and 1 of you, Mr. Voss. Be smart about this." "There's 2 of us," Lark said. Every head turned toward her. She was standing into the corner of the cabin, not in the open, using the corner for cover in the way she'd been calculating since the riders came into view. The fire poker was useless, and she knew it. What she had was a position and a voice and 4 months of knowing this compound in the dark, as well as she knew anything. "2 of us," she repeated, "and 1 of you has a rifle pointed at the center of his chest from 30 feet. The man with the rifle on his saddle went very still. It was not true. Gideon's rifle was pointed at the lead man, but it was dark, and she was at the corner, and her silhouette against the cabin wall could have been holding anything, and the man with the rifle on his saddle had just been told otherwise, and he was doing the arithmetic. "Lark," Gideon said, a warning in her name. "Don't push this further than it goes." She ignored it. "You came for documents," she said to the lead rider. "They're not in the cabin. You already checked the cabin 3 weeks ago." She let that land. "You set the barn fire as a distraction, and someone came in the back while we were on the fire line. You found the hiding spot empty." She paused. "You still don't know where they are." The lead man's horse shifted. He controlled it without looking down. "Smart woman," he said. He didn't say it as a compliment. "Smart enough to know that what you're doing tonight is assault and armed trespass, and my description of your horses and your faces and your approach route from the North Ravine is going in a letter to the Sacramento District Court tomorrow morning." She paused. "Your employer's name is already in front of a judge. Whatever he's paying you, you should ask yourself whether it's enough to be named in a contempt filing 2 weeks before a hearing." Silence. The man with the rifle on his saddle had moved it off the ready position. She didn't know when exactly he'd done that. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, cataloged it, filed it. The lead man looked at Gideon for a moment, then at Lark. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Gideon said. "It isn't. But tonight it is." He kept the rifle up. "Turn your horses around." Another silence. Longer this time. Lark kept absolutely still at the corner of the cabin, her breathing shallow and controlled, her hands gripping the useless poker behind her back where they couldn't see it shake. The lead man turned his horse. The others followed. They went back the way they'd come, up through the north ravine, the sound of their horses diminishing slowly into the dark, until the only sounds left were the wind and the distant lowing of cattle settling after the disturbance. Gideon lowered his rifle. Lark let out a breath that she'd been holding since she opened her mouth. She came away from the corner of the cabin and stood in the yard, and her legs were not entirely steady, which she would have been mortified to admit to anyone, but which was apparently just what happened after you bluffed 4 armed men in the dark with a fire poker. "You told them you had a rifle on the man with the rifle," Gideon said. He looked at her hands. She was still holding the fire poker, which was rather obviously a fire poker. "It was dark," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to it, something she hadn't heard from him before. "It was," he said. "I need to sit down," she said. "Yes, so do I." They went inside. Gideon made coffee because it was 3 in the morning and neither of them was going to sleep now, and the coffee was something to do with their hands. Lark sat at the table and put the fire poker on the floor and looked at the wall. "They'll come back," she said. "Before the hearing? Maybe. But not tonight, and probably not the same way." He set the coffee down in front of her. "You called their bluff." "I had no cards. I was bluffing about bluffing." "I know. It still worked." He sat across from her. "You named their methods. The barn fire, the cabin search. You told them we knew exactly what they'd done and that it was already documented and that it was going in front of a judge." He looked at his coffee. "That changes the calculation for them. They came here tonight thinking we were scrambling. You told them we weren't. Crow will know by tomorrow." "Yes. And Crow is not the 4 men on horses. Crow is the man who sends them." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "He might try something more direct. Or he might decide the hearing is a lost cause and pull back." Gideon paused. "He's not stupid. He's been running this for 11 years precisely because he's patient and methodical. If he sees the case clearly, if he calculates that pressing harder just adds criminal exposure to a land case he's going to lose, you think he'll stand down?" "I think there's a chance." He met her eyes. "I also think you should sleep in the workshop for the next 2 weeks." She looked at him. "Not—" He stopped. Tried again. "For safety. The workshop is stone. It locks from the inside now. If something happens while I understand," she said. "I'll have Mateo put a man on the North Ravine from tonight forward, and I'm writing to Firth tomorrow about what happened, every detail. I'll write the description of the riders and their horses." She thought of the letter she'd cited to the lead man. "We should actually send it, not as a bluff." "Yes." He looked at his coffee. "Lark." "What?" "Tonight. What you did at the corner of the cabin." He paused. "I've been fighting this alone for a long time. I'd stopped thinking about it as something 2 people could do." She waited to see if there was more. "I'm saying thank you," he said. "Badly, probably." "You're saying it fine," she said. She picked up her coffee and they sat in the quiet cabin with the cold pressed against the windows and the valley dark and still outside. And after a while the silence between them had the quality it sometimes got in the late evenings. Not empty, not requiring anything to be done with it. Just 2 people in the same room after something hard, drinking bad coffee, and not needing to make it into more than it was. 2 weeks later, Aldous Firth stood in a Sacramento courtroom and began dismantling 11 years of carefully constructed fraud. Lark was in the gallery. She'd ridden to Sacramento with Gideon and Firth 3 days before the hearing, the original journals and documents in a locked case that Firth had brought specifically for transport. Reinforced wood, brass fittings, a lock he held the only key to. The case hadn't left his possession from the moment she handed it to him. The courtroom was not what she expected from the weight of what it contained. It was a plain room with wood benches and high windows that let in a cold gray November light. The judge was a compact man named Prentice, who had the expression of someone who had heard a great many things that failed to surprise him and was reserving judgment on whether this would be different. Rufus Crowe was on the other side of the room. She saw him for the first time. He was older than she'd pictured, late 50s, heavy through the shoulders, with a large face that had gone ruddy from years outdoors, and pale eyes that moved around the room with a constant measuring intelligence. He was well dressed without being ostentatious about it, which told her something about how he understood himself. He had 2 lawyers seated beside him and a third man behind him who was not a lawyer, a compact, watchful figure who she recognized after a moment as the lead writer from the North Ravine. She looked at that man for a moment and then looked away. Firth was methodical. He built the case in layers, the way you build a structure that has to hold weight. Foundation first. He started with the original survey, establishing its provenance and the credentials of the man who'd executed it. Then the notation system, with Boaz's testimony explaining the triangle and dot markers and their significance in professional surveying practice. Then the insurance posts. Boaz again, technical and precise, citing his measurements, his dating assessment, his conclusion that the posts were placed between 15 and 18 years ago in positions that established the eastern boundary with unambiguous precision. Then the amendments. Firth laid them out in sequence, each one dated, each one annotated with Harold Peirce's signature, each one placed against the original coordinates in a visual chart that Lark had prepared. He didn't call it fraud yet. He just showed the sequence. He let the accumulated weight of 5 amendments and 62 feet of boundary drift speak for itself. Crowe's lawyers cross-examined Boaz for over an hour. Boaz was unrattled. He answered everything in the same measured technical language he'd used during his examination of the posts. And when the lawyers tried to suggest the dating of the posts was imprecise, he explained the methodology so thoroughly and so accessibly that the judge leaned forward twice to listen more carefully. On the second day, Firth put the fence line documentation into evidence. Lark's measurements, her notations, the disturbed soil around the primary boundary markers, the 2-inch discrepancy she'd measured against the permanent rock landmark. He also put in the chronological record of incidents at the Voss property, the cut fence, the pasture fire, the feed barn, the night visit, as a supplementary exhibit, not as primary evidence of the land claim, but as context for the sustained nature of the interference. Crowe's lawyers objected to the incident record. The judge overruled them. She watched Crowe's face when the judge overruled. She'd been watching it throughout. It was the face of a man who was very good at not showing things, and for most of the hearing it had been professionally blank. When the judge overruled the incident record objection, something shifted slightly around his eyes. Not panic, not defeat, a recalculation. The look of a man who is running numbers in his head and arriving at answers he doesn't like. The Crowe legal team presented their case on the third day. They had the county amendments, the adjusted survey data, the claim filing with its supporting documentation. It was substantial paper. Without the insurance markers and without Lark's cross-reference chart of the amendment sequence, it might have looked definitive. Against those things, it looked like what it was. The judge asked for 1 day of deliberation. They waited in a rooming house 2 blocks from the court. Gideon sat in the chair by the window and looked at the street. Lark sat at the small desk and tried to read, and mostly didn't. Firth went to meet with a colleague and came back in the evening and said nothing substantive, which was either good or bad, and there was no way to know which. The next morning, Judge Prentice read his ruling in 11 minutes. The Voss eastern boundary was to be established in accordance with the original survey, as verified by the independent examination of the insurance markers and the professional testimony of the registered surveyor. All 5 county amendments affecting the boundary description were found to contain material errors and were to be struck from the county record. A referral was to be made to the district attorney regarding the conduct of certain county officials in processing the amendments. The Crowe land claim for the eastern section was dismissed with prejudice. Firth allowed himself a small, contained satisfaction. A single nod, the closing of his folder. Gideon sat very still in the gallery bench. Lark was beside him, 3 inches of wood between their elbows. She felt him breathe out, not dramatically, just a long, slow exhale, the kind that a man releases when he has been holding something in his chest for so long he's forgotten the shape of breath without it. She didn't look at him. She let him have it. She looked at Rufus Crowe instead. He was already standing, already speaking in a low voice to his lawyers, already performing the posture of a man making plans rather than a man absorbing defeat. His pale eyes came across the room once and found her, not Gideon, her, and stayed for a long moment. She held his gaze. He looked away first. The ride back from Sacramento took 2 days, and most of it passed in a quiet that was different from every other quiet Lark had shared with Gideon in the past 4 months. Before, the quiet between them had been functional. Two people conserving energy for the work ahead, not wasting words on things that didn't need saying. This quiet had a different texture, looser, like a rope that has been holding tremendous tension for a long time and has finally been allowed to go slack, and the rope itself doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of the pull. Gideon rode for long stretches without speaking, looking at the road or the hills or nothing in particular. Lark rode beside him and let him have the silence. She had her own version of it to sit with. The hearing had ended 2 days ago, and she still hadn't fully processed what that meant. Not for the ranch, not for him, and not for the question that had been living quietly at the back of her mind since the first week she'd arrived in this valley. What happens now? They stopped for the night at a way station inn outside of Stockton, a plain 2-room establishment that served food of the adequate and unremarkable variety and had stabling for the horses. They ate at a table near the fire because November had turned genuinely cold in the foothills, the kind of cold that found the gaps in your coat and reminded you it was there. Firth had parted ways with them in Sacramento, heading back to his office with the satisfied efficiency of a man who had done good work and was already thinking about the next thing. Gideon ordered coffee after supper and stared at it for a while. Firth thinks there will be a criminal referral, he said, the district attorney's office, from the judge's referral about the county amendments and purse. You expected that. I expected the possibility. It's different when it actually happens. He turned the cup slowly on the table. Crow will face real consequences, not just losing the land claim, the fraud itself, the methods. He paused. It'll take time. These things always take time, but it'll happen. Lark thought about the compact, watchful man behind Crow in the courtroom, the lead rider from the North Ravine. She thought about the pasture fire and the barn and the displace's flour tin and the way Crow had looked across the courtroom at her before looking away. Good, she said simply. Emmett Cole, Gideon said. The name of the man whose barn had burned 8 years ago, the one who hadn't simply sold and moved. Yes, he didn't say anything else about it. Neither did she. There were some things that didn't become smaller when you talked about them, and the only honest response to that was to acknowledge the weight and carry it appropriately. They finished the coffee and went to their separate rooms, and Lark lay on the inn mattress, softer than her mattress at the ranch, which was not saying much, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the $40. She thought about it specifically and practically, which was the only way she allowed herself to think about money. $40 was what her father had received, not what she'd received. She'd received the season's work, the roof over her head, the food from the provisions shelf, and the possibility that Gideon had mentioned on her first night, a workshop. 40 acres of bottomland, not a promise, a possibility. She needed to know, before she went any further in her own thinking, whether that possibility was still on the table and what its actual terms were. She needed to ask directly, which was the only way she knew how to do things, but which required a particular kind of steadiness she wasn't entirely sure she had tonight, with the court ruling fresh and the road dust still in her hair and 4 months of accumulated unsaid things pressing against the back of her throat. She would ask tomorrow, on the road, in daylight, where everything was cleaner. She turned onto her side and told herself to sleep. This time she managed it. She asked the next morning, an hour out of Stockton on the road back into the foothills. They were riding through open country, the hills still gold with dry autumn grass, the sky a clear, pale blue that was beautiful in the detached way that good weather always was, regardless of what was happening beneath it. She said, I need to ask you about the arrangement you mentioned my first night. Gideon looked over at her. The workshop and the bottom land. Yes. You said it was a possibility, not a promise. It depended on how things went. She kept her eyes on the road. Things have gone. I want to know what the possibility looks like now. He was quiet for a moment, not the evasive kind of quiet, the considering kind. I should have been clear about it from the beginning, he said. What does that mean? It means I told you it was a possibility because I didn't want to make a promise I couldn't keep if the case went wrong. But I'd already decided, before you'd been there 2 weeks, that you'd earned more than a season's wage. He paused. The workshop is yours. The 40 acres is yours. The deed transfer is something Firth can handle when we're back, if you want him to. Lark kept riding. The road bent slightly north, and the foothills opened up ahead, a long familiar view of the kind of country she'd known her whole life. I want him to, she said. All right. Another silence, but not an uncomfortable one. There's something else I want to say, Gideon said, and his voice had the particular deliberate quality it got when he was about to say something he'd been preparing. The way this season went, what you did, what you found, how you held that ranch together when I couldn't be in 3 places at once. He paused. I've been thinking about the word partnership. What it would mean in a practical sense. Not as an obligation, not because I owe you something, but because what I built alone is considerably less than what we built together these past 4 months, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. Lark considered what he was saying and what he wasn't saying, and how much of the unsaid she was willing to address out here on a public road with 40 miles still to go. One thing at a time, she said. The deed transfer first. Yes. After that, we can talk about what partnership looks like. That's fair. It's not fair, she said. It's practical. I don't make decisions about the future on an empty stomach on a road covered in dust. I make them after I've slept in my own bed and thought about them properly. He almost smiled. She could see it at the corner of his mouth. Not quite there, but approaching. Your own bed being in the cabin. My own bed being wherever I decide to put it, she said, which is currently the cabin. This time he did smile. It changed his face more than she expected, made him look younger and less careful, and like someone who'd had fewer reasons to smile than he deserved. She looked at the road ahead and did not examine the warmth that produced in her chest. They reached the valley late in the afternoon of the second day, coming over the familiar ridge where the road dropped and the land opened up in its theatrical way. The broad, flat floor, the silver thread of the creek, the gold grass, the small cabin at the center of it all. Mateo met them in the yard. He had the expression of a man who had been waiting with news he considered significant. What happened? Gideon said, climbing down from his horse. 2 days after you left for Sacramento, Crow's North operation filed for an extension on their water rights. The county clerk's office denied it. Mateo folded his arms. Word got out fast. 2 of the smaller ranchers who'd been having trouble with boundary disputes, both of them got their filings reviewed and corrected within the same week. He paused. I think when the court ruling came through, some people at the county decided it was a good time to start being honest about their records. Gideon stood for a moment absorbing that. Anyone from Crow's operation contact the ranch? No, not directly. Mateo paused again, with the air of someone saving the most significant item for last. But Harold Pearce resigned from the county office the day after the ruling. Nobody's seen him since. Lark was still on her horse. She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. There was nothing satisfying about it exactly. Pearce resigning didn't undo the years. It didn't give back the second lawyer's office in Colton, or the feed barn, or 3 head of cattle, or Emmett Cole. It was just a man deciding that the comfortable position he'd held for years had become untenable, which was a very small accounting for a very large debt. But it was something. The structure Crow had built was losing its supports, one by one, and that process had a momentum to it that was difficult to stop once it started. Good, Gideon said, and went to put up his horse. The deed transfer took 3 weeks to complete. Firth handled it from Sacramento, and there were forms and a county recording and a notarization that required Lark to ride to Colton on a cold December morning and sign her name in front of a clerk who looked at her with the particular blankness of a man trying to work out what category she belonged in, and coming up empty. She signed. She took her copy of the recorded deed. She rode home. Home. She caught the word in her own head about halfway back to the valley and held it up to examine it the way she examined most things, directly, without blinking. She'd been using it for several weeks without noticing. The cabin was home, the valley was home. The workshop, which she'd started cleaning out on the first day back from Sacramento, pulling decades of accumulated tools and junk into the yard and sorting them by what could be used and what couldn't, the workshop was specifically and definitively home in a way that had a different quality from the cabin, because the workshop was hers in a legal and permanent sense that nothing had ever been before. She'd found the workbench under the accumulated debris, long, solid sycamore top, older than most of the other structures on the ranch, and better built than any of them. She'd cleaned it with linseed oil, and it had come back to a warm honey color that had clearly been there all along, waiting. She'd found a set of chisels in a leather roll behind a loose stone in the wall, old but sound, the kind of quality that didn't get made as a matter of course anymore. She'd started building a table, not because anyone needed a table, because she had wood from the salvaged barn frame that Gideon had offered her, and she had tools, and she had a workbench, and she had, for the first time in her 22 years, evenings that belonged entirely to her, hours that no one had prior claim on, time that didn't belong to a father who'd sell it for $40 without asking her opinion. The table was not going to be beautiful. She was good with her hands, but she was learning furniture as she'd learned everything else in her life, from the practical end, with errors, adjusting as she went. The first joint she cut was slightly off, and she had to recut it, which wasted a piece of timber she couldn't replace. The second was better. The third was what she'd meant the first one to be. Gideon had come to the workshop doorway one evening and looked at the work in progress on the bench without saying anything. "It's not done," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything about it. You have a face." "I was thinking it looks like a table," he said, "which is what you said you were making. It has uneven legs." "By how much?" "1/8 of an inch on the northeast leg." He looked at the table. "That's not an uneven table. That's a table with character." She gave him a look. "I mean it," he said, and he did mean it. She could tell by now when he was being straightforward and when he was managing something. He was being straightforward. "My father built the kitchen table in the cabin himself. It has a 3-inch crack down the center from when the wood dried wrong, and he never got around to filling it properly. I've eaten at it every day for 23 years. Lark looked at her table. 1/8 of an inch. Character. "Go away," she said. "I'm working." He went away, and she heard him laughing. Quietly, not at her expense, just the sound of a man who was finding the world slightly more bearable than usual. She went back to the table leg and did not smile. She almost managed it. December brought the stolen cattle back, not Crow's doing, or rather, not directly. The 3 head that had drifted through the cut fence in October had been pastured on the Quinn land, which had changed hands twice in the intervening months, as Crow's financial situation began contracting with the pressure of the criminal investigation and the failed land claim. The new holder of the Quinn land, a straightforward hay farmer from the valley north of Colton, had contacted Mateo about some branded cattle grazing his property and arranged a return without incident. Mateo brought them in on a cold Tuesday and reported to Gideon with the factual satisfaction of a man who likes it when things are accounted for properly. 3 head. The full count restored. Gideon wrote it into the ledger and told Mateo to let the crew know, because the crew had spent October and November knowing there were 3 head unaccounted for, and that kind of open tab wore on working men. The news of Rufus Crow's situation continued to arrive in pieces over the weeks that followed, the way large things tend to disassemble. Not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily, and without the possibility of reversal. The criminal referral from the court had been accepted by the district attorney in Sacramento. The investigation was formal now, which meant it had subpoena power and the ability to compel financial records and correspondence that Crow had spent years keeping private. 2 of the men who'd worked closely with him in various capacities came forward in exchange for consideration from the prosecution, a development that Firth reported in a letter that arrived in January with his characteristic restraint, noting only that the investigation appears to be proceeding with considerable momentum. 2 of the smaller operations Crow had acquired under pressure had their ownership situations reviewed. In one case, the original owner was found to still have a viable claim. The legal details were complicated, but the direction was clear. In the other, the original owner had died, but his daughter, a woman in her 40s living in San Francisco, had been located and informed of the situation. The empire, in other words, was coming apart at the seams it had always had. It did not come apart quickly or dramatically. It came apart the way it had been built, methodically, piece by piece, through paperwork and process, and the slow grinding of official machinery finally pointed in the right direction. It was not satisfying in the way that story endings sometimes were, where the villain falls and the falling is complete and visible. Crow was not finished. He was diminished and diminishing, and the road ahead of him was significantly narrower than the one he'd traveled for 12 years. Whether it narrowed all the way to a courtroom and a formal accounting was something the law would determine in its own time. Lark had made her peace with that imperfection. It was not the ending she would have designed if endings were things you could design. But she was a woman who'd spent her whole life working with what was actually in front of her rather than what she wished was there. And what was actually in front of her was this. The land was protected, the fraud was exposed, the case had been won, and the man who'd spent 11 years trying to take this valley was no longer in a position to threaten it. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. In February, she finished the table. She carried it out of the workshop on a cold, clear morning and set it in the yard and walked around it and looked at it from all four sides. It was a plain table, rectangular, sycamore, with a shelf below the top surface and square-cut legs and joints that were not perfect but were solid. The northeast leg was 1/8 of an inch shorter than the others, which she'd addressed with a small wood shim rather than recut the leg, because recutting the leg at this stage would have taken 1/4 inch and changed the whole proportion. She stood looking at it. It was the first piece of furniture she'd made entirely with her own hands, from salvaged timber, in a workshop she owned, on land she held the deed to. She had made other things in her life. She had repaired things and maintained things and kept things running that would have failed without her attention. But she had never made something from nothing that was entirely, unconditionally hers. The table had character, as Gideon had said. It had 1/8 of an inch honest imperfection and joints that had been cut correctly the third time, and a surface that had been sanded until it was smooth in the way that sycamore gets when you do the work properly. Not glass smooth, but alive, the grain raised slightly, the wood warm in the winter morning light. She pulled over a stump and sat down and looked at it for a while. Gideon came out of the barn and stopped when he saw her sitting in the cold yard. He looked at the table. He came over and stood beside it and ran his hand flat across the surface the way a person does when they're checking the work is real. "It's done," she said. "Yes." He straightened. "It's good, Lark." She looked at it. "It's honest," she said. "It's what I know how to do right now. Next one will be better." He sat down on the porch steps so they were roughly the same height. "How many are you planning?" "As many as people will buy. I talked to Doyle last week. He makes supply runs to Colton and to the settlement at Birch Creek. He said the Birch Creek trading post was looking for someone to supply furniture. They've been buying what comes off the freight wagons from the east, and the quality is poor." She looked at the table. "I can make better than poor, and I can price it fairly if I'm not paying freight from 6 states away." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You've thought this through." "I've been thinking about it since October." She paused. "The 40 acres along the creek tributary. The bottom land. It's good timber country on the east edge, mostly oak and sycamore. If I'm careful about what I take and how I take it, I can source material without clearing anything that shouldn't be cleared." "It's your land," he said. "You don't need my permission for any of that." "I know I don't." She looked at him. "I'm telling you because it's adjacent to your grazing land, and I don't want you to be surprised by the activity." She paused. "And because we've been talking around the word partnership for 3 months, and I thought you should know what my side of it looks like." He looked at her steadily. "What does your side of it look like?" "A furniture operation that uses my land, my workshop, my materials, and my labor, which grows at whatever pace I can sustain honestly without overextending before I know what I'm doing." She looked at the table again. "And a person who is in this valley by choice, not by arrangement, not because she was sent here for $40. She met his eyes. By choice. Gideon sat with that for a moment. The morning light was moving across the yard as the sun came up over the eastern ridge. The same light she'd watched every morning for 4 months. The same ridge that held the insurance markers his father had set in the ground 15 years ago. A father who'd built something and tried to protect it and died thinking he'd failed. He hadn't failed. He'd trusted the work and left it for someone who could find it. "I'd like to ask you something," Gideon said. She waited. "Not about the partnership. Not about the land or the operation." He was choosing his words with care, which he did when the words mattered. "About whether you want to stay." "I already said I was staying." "Staying is different from—" He stopped. "I mean more than the workshop and the deed and the work. I mean—" He looked at the table because apparently looking at the table was easier than finishing the sentence, which she found humanly understandable. I've been alone in this valley for 11 years. I made my peace with it. Or I told myself I had. He looked up at her. I don't want to make my peace with it again. Lark looked at him for a long moment. This man who slept in a barn to give her the house, who'd been carrying his father's war for a decade without anyone beside him, who almost smiled before he actually smiled, and whose face changed completely when he did, and who had said my father would have liked you on a ridge in October, like it was a simple observable fact. She was 22 years old, and she'd been told her entire life what she was worth and what she was for, and every version of that accounting had left her out of the room when the decision was made. This was the first time anyone had asked her directly. I'm staying, she said. Not because of the land or the work, because I want to. She paused. That's the first time in my life I've been able to say that about a place. I'm not going to waste it. He nodded. A slow, certain nod. The kind that meant something had settled, not as a resolution to a conflict, but as a foundation being established. Good, he said. Good, she said. They sat in the cold February morning with the table between them, plain and honest and imperfect, the sycamore grain warm in the winter light. In the pasture, the cattle were moving toward the creek in the morning way they had, unhurried, the grass silver with frost. Mateo's voice carried from the north fence where the crew was starting the morning work. The valley was ordinary and extraordinary in the same moment. She had learned to hold both of those things at once. Tan. Here is what I think about. When I think about this story, I think about the $40. Not as a wound, although it was one, as a fact that revealed something true about the world Lark lived in. A world that had very specific ideas about what a woman's work was worth and who got to decide. Her father didn't sell her out of cruelty. He sold her out of the ordinary human failure of treating a person as a resource instead of a person. That failure is not spectacular. It is not villainous in the way that Rufus Crowe was villainous. It is smaller and more common, and in some ways harder to name. What Lark did with the $40, this is what I keep returning to. She didn't spend her season trying to undo it, or escape it, or pretend it hadn't happened. She carried it forward into the work and let the work change what it meant. By the end, the $40 that purchased her labor had become the deed to 40 acres of bottomland and a stone workshop and a table made from salvaged timber with an eighth of an inch imperfection in the northeast leg. She didn't transform the $40 into something beautiful. She built something real with it. I think about Gideon's father, too. A man who surveyed every inch of his own land and hid the evidence in journals no one thought to read properly for 15 years. He died thinking he'd lost. He left behind a case that just needed the right eyes to find it. There's something in that worth sitting with. The idea that the work you do in careful obscurity, the detailed patient work that no one applauds, sometimes matters most in ways you'll never get to see. And I think about what it costs to fight something slowly. Rufus Crowe didn't build his empire in a day. He built it 14 feet at a time, over years, through the patient accumulation of small corruptions that individually looked almost harmless. That's how a lot of damage is done. Not in one dramatic act, but in a series of small ones that are each deniable on their own. Gideon fought back the only way he could, by preserving the truth, documenting everything, waiting for the right piece to fall into place. 11 years is a long time to wait. Most people couldn't sustain it. He wasn't a hero in the conventional sense. He was a stubborn, solitary, careful man who refused to give up on a thing his father built, even when giving up would have been easier. That stubbornness is not glamorous. It doesn't make good speeches. But it is the thing that kept 6,000 acres out of the hands of someone who would have stripped them of everything worth having. And it's the thing that was still there when Lark arrived. The larger truth this story tells me, the one I carry out of it, is this. Belonging is not given. It is built. It is built the way Lark built that table, from salvaged material, with imperfect joints, corrected and recorrected until the thing is solid enough to hold weight. No one handed her the valley. No one handed her the workshop or the deed or the right to say I'm staying because I want to. She earned it by doing the work that needed doing, by paying attention when no one else was, by running toward a burning barn when every sensible instinct said to run the other way. She was worth more than $40. She always was. She just had to find the place where she could prove it to herself. That place was a valley. in the California foothills, 6,000 acres of grassland and creek water and difficult history, owned by a man who slept in a barn and carried his father's war and didn't know yet what the right pair of eyes would find in a stack of old journals. It was not a perfect place. It had burned pasture and a missing feed barn and an eighth of an inch table leg and 11 years of old wounds in the soil. It was exactly enough.